As we looked at the art of the High Renaissance, we saw that many of the paintings by the major artists shared certain qualities. They were all very much interested in a sort of idealized perfection that was based on the study of perfect proportions, often using lessons learned from ancient Greek and Roman art, but imbuing them with a greater sense of the inner soul of the figure. Many of the works were based on the idea of harmony and rationality and balance, and indeed many of them relied on geometry as an underpinning compositional choice. After around 1520, the style of Renaissance art began to change, and some of the perfected harmonies that we saw developing in the Renaissance began to skew towards something a little more strange. In the 1920s, historians who studied Renaissance art noticed this difference beginning around 1520. They noted that the hallmark of these works is that they were significantly more mannered, in other words, significantly more artificial. And they coined a term, mannerism, to describe these late Renaissance works that had a more artificial character. So what are we talking about when we talk about this artificiality? There's a certain sort of artificial beauty to the figures. With Leonardo and Raphael, we saw the faces often giving us great insight into their humanity and feelings, but there's something about the faces here that become significantly more decorative. The overall composition is asymmetrical. It doesn't seem to have much in the way of a stabilizing geometry. It's much harder to trace isosceles triangles or perfect circles over the tops of the composition to see how the artist laid out the figures. They seem awkward, top-heavy, out of balance. The body types are strange. The composition's crowded. There's not enough room for the figures. We have these awkward croppings where we have just here the infant John the Baptist popping up out of the corner simply to point to Jesus and filling up that corner of the composition with a figure. It seems as if Bronzino is interested in sort of filling up as much of the real estate of the picture plane with something. It gives it a little breathing room at the top, but you'll notice that there's no setting for this image. It's just a simple gray background. There's no real space there. No attempt to use one-point perspective to create a rational extension of our space. Everything is crowded right up close to us, as if it's a curtain of figures. So we add the sort of imbalance of some of the poses. Jesus' pose looks like he's rolling around. It doesn't really have any of that sense of permanence and harmonious balance. There's no sort of, think of contrapposta for a standing figure and how that's a pose you could hold forever. Jesus is sort of flopping about there on that rock, and it's, again, the rock itself difficult to read. The subject matter is fairly straightforward. It's the Holy Family, so it's the Virgin in the center with the green shawl, that sort of beautiful green shawl. The Mannerists love very decorative colors. Joseph, her husband, over her left shoulder, on the right with his walking staff. He leads them on their travels, especially when they have to flee to Egypt to escape the massacre that's ordered by King Herod. Jesus in front of her, kneeling and looking to his mother, blessing with that pose we've seen before. Baptist, as already mentioned, in the lower corner, pointing to Christ. The old woman on the left, most certainly the Virgin's mother, St. Anne, even though one might guess the mother of John the Baptist, but St. Elizabeth. But St. Elizabeth is roughly the same age as the Virgin Mary, and this woman is far too old, so she must be St. Anne. Another Mannerist work that at first looks like Madonna and Child by Andrea del Sarto down at the National Gallery. This was in fact originally planned to be a Madonna and Child image, and then Del Sarto changed it to be an allegory for the virtue of charity. So the woman at the right with her breast exposed, nursing the infant, is an embodiment of charity, giving of oneself to nourish the other. Who the other two figures are is kind of anybody's guess. One of the hallmarks of mannerism is that the iconography, the subject matter, the symbolism becomes extraordinarily complicated. And that's part of the artificiality of mannerism, is that complicated iconography. Other hallmarks of mannerism are sort of the sharp and contrasting colors that we see, the bright yellow sleeves of the figure of Charity against the hot pink of her robe. Certainly is a jarring and meant to be decorative color scheme. There's also an amazing sense of imbalance. That infant, really looking like if she lets go, he goes crashing down, has none of the sense of contrapposto balance and poise. The unexplained infant on the left with the blue sash pointing out toward us, also equally imbalanced, sort of kneeling up on top of who knows what is underneath that green fabric, and the leg behind not offering much in the way of balance and leaning hard on the arm of Charity in order to maintain its balance. But again, all of these figures seem to have a strange sense of imbalance that adds to the artificiality. You'll also notice that the proportions are a bit off. The arm, for example, in foreshortening, seems to get smaller as it gets closer to us rather than larger as it should, and the hand seems preternaturally small. Other bits are difficult. The fire in the upper right corner is meant to be part of Charity, I believe, but I'm not sure it's well explained. And then you look behind the rear shoulder of this boy with the blue sash, and you see a hand resting on an orb that doesn't belong to anybody. Whose hand is that, and what is up with that orb? And these are all sort of unanswered questions. So again, with mannerism, we have odd figure types, a sense of imbalance, a spaceless crowding of the figures close to the picture plane, decorative and unnatural color choices. All of these things add to the artificiality of art that we begin to see in the 1520s. Now, the question we should ask ourselves is why did things change in the 1520s in Italy? The simple answer is that artists were borrowing forms from the great painters of the Renaissance. Looking back to particularly Raphael and Michelangelo and their terrific achievements in the human figure and composition, and simply lifting figures out of that, maybe manipulating them somewhat for their new context. And this sort of second-hand realism, where art is based on other art rather than on a close observation of nature, leads to art becoming more artificial. So that's sort of the simple answer, right? That things changed in the 1520s because our Mannerist artists are borrowing so many of their forms from works by Michelangelo and Raphael. At the same time, a second reason is that many of the painters of the High Renaissance, the ones that we associate with the High Renaissance, died before 1520. Leonardo died in 1519. Raphael died in 1520. And we shouldn't forget Pope Julius II, the man who commissioned the greatest works by Raphael and Michelangelo. He died in 1514. So many of the people who led the Renaissance movement, particularly the High Renaissance movement, were all gone by 1520. We have a new generation of artists. Finally, the third explanation for why Mannerism comes about in the 1520s is, in fact, that the 1520s were an era of great social unrest in Europe. Really, everything was topsy-turvy, like a Mannerist picture. We need to look only to a few examples to sort of set the stage for this. Think about Martin Luther. and the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation in 1517, a questioning of the authority of the papacy in Rome. This led to a peasants' revolt throughout all of Germany in 1524. At the same time that Luther is in conflict with the church, there is a major conflict between the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, and the King of France, Francis I. Both of them are fighting for control over the northern part of Italy, around Milan. So they're fighting on French soil, and both of them are looking to the Pope, Pope Clement VII, for support, my side versus him. Clement VII is the nephew of Lorenzo de' Medici. He's Giuliano de' Medici. So by this point, I think, as one of our classmates had mentioned, the Medici have risen to the power of the papacy. During that conflict, Pope Clement VII throws his weight behind Francis I. He strikes an alliance with King Francis. And this leads in 1527 to the sack of Rome. Charles V, the emperor, to fight against the alliance between Clement and Francis, marches on Rome, and Rome is overthrown, really for the first time in 1,000 years. So all of this adds to the sort of social unrest in society that parallels the sort of unrest we see in artistic imagery in the 1520s. We can add to this a dozen other historical events. Turkish invasions, for example, into Italy, England's split from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII, so on and so on. There's so much going on in the 1520s that leads to a sort of instability in society that in many ways we can see as being reflected in the instability of these pictures. Another Mannerist work on the right, non-religious picture as well. Another one by Bronzino, who we looked at. Both of these works were made for King Francis I, who loved Italian art. The one on the right, the new one here, was a gift from the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo I de' Medici, named after the Cosimo of the 15th century, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. He's the great-grandson of Lorenzo de' Medici, thus he's probably, I think, that Clement VII, the Pope, is his great-uncle, right? And he commissions this. This is after, by the way, the death of Clement VII, but that doesn't really matter. He commissioned this work from Bronzino to be presented to King Francis I as a gift. As I mentioned, Francis I had a thing for Italian Renaissance art. Francis I was the king who had hired Leonardo at the end of his life. This is where Leonardo died. It was in the service of King Francis I. And because of that, the Mona Lisa winds up in the Louvre Palace because it went to the royal collection since Leonardo had no children. He also bought, Francis I did, the unused statues by Michelangelo that were meant to go on the tomb of Pope Julius II. So the dying slave that we see here was originally designed to adorn the Julius tomb, and when it went unused, Francis bought it, and it too resides in the Louvre Museum. By the 1520s, Francis is still enamored with Italian Renaissance art, but that meant that he became deeply interested in mannerism, because they never called it that. Remember, mannerism wasn't coined as a term until the 1520s. It's still Renaissance art to him. And so this Bronzino that we see on the right was a gift that he would have warmly accepted as a work of Renaissance art, even though to us it's highly mannerist. So let's take a look closely at the painting. The image focuses on Venus. In Roman mythology, Venus is the mother of Cupid. She's holding one of his arrows. She's either taken it from his quiver, which you can see hanging behind him in green, or perhaps he's hit her with it. In any event, they are amorous. She is kissing her son. And if we look closely, you'll see that she's even slipping him the tongue, which is really kind of disgusting if you think about it. Ew, right? This is a very strange anatomy, or excuse me, iconography. And of course, it's foolishness, right? For a mother, goddess or not, to be embracing her son in this way. The metaphor continues is that the figure in the upper right corner is Father Time. And of course, time reveals all foolishness. And you'll notice he's in the act of pulling back that curtain to reveal to us the stupid behavior of Venus and her son, the foolish behavior of Venus and her son. We definitely know he's time, Father Time, because of the hourglass that's dripping sand just behind his bald head. Note that extraordinarily muscular arm, just sort of teeming with muscles. If I asked you who this reminds you of, what one artist would this remind you of, I think most of the class would say, oh yeah, that's a very Michelangelo-like arm. And even though it's not a direct quote from the Sistine Ceiling, I imagine if we looked long enough, we could probably find something that it relates directly to, or more directly to. But remember that Mannerist artists reused a lot of motifs from Michelangelo and Raphael as they composed their painting. Now that the foolishness is revealed by Father Time, a little boy rejoices. We think he must be the embodiment of folly, thus Venus, Cupid, folly, and time. He's about to pitch flowers on them. He's picked a bunch of pink roses, and he's about to sort of strew them over our embracing figures. He's the one figure who thinks this is a really good idea. Everyone else seems to be reacting against it. Now, it's totally Mannerist in style. It's spaceless. Everything is crowded up close to the picture plane, and there's no sense of depth or space here. That spaceless composition is utterly crowded with things. Almost every square inch is covered with something that adds a little bit of symbolism. A lot of this is to us still somewhat unexplained. The two doves by the foot of Cupid, for example, seem to be beak to beak and may be a parallel to Venus and Cupid. Hard to say. By the foot of Venus, a pair of theatrical masks. Again, masks as a symbol of artificiality, and that seems to be a hallmark of Mannerist art, but they're also placed so that there's no inch of the painting that isn't covered with something to interpret. And this has left us often in a perplexed state. We don't quite know what to do with them. Particularly Mannerist about this are the colors that are chosen, the sort of decorative colors, hot pinks, the pillow that Cupid kneels on, the lime greens behind the figure of Folly, that lavender blue that covers most of the composition, the bright green of Cupid's quiver, and the orange of the buckle. All of these are incredibly bright, sometimes jarring, but certainly decorative color schemes. Probably the single most Mannerist thing about this is the anatomy. Look at Cupid's body and try to articulate it in your mind. His shoulder is tucked underneath the armpit of Venus, yet somehow his neck stretches to the top of her shoulder. Again, if you try to figure out exactly how this works, I'm going to try and pen it together, right? How does that fit that body type? It's just so strangely awkward. It simply doesn't work. The body twists and cavorts in different ways, and it seems to be sort of stuffed into that space so that we can look instead at this sort of, the ripples of flesh across his back, his leg, and his buttocks, meant to be decorative rather than harmonious and rational. On the other side, there's this strange snake lady behind Folly who looks out to us with those limpid eyes. And look at those wonderful colors, those magenta purples and blues. But her body turns into a snake with lion's legs. She holds in the hand on the left a honeycomb. This makes us think that she's pleasure, but the hand on the right holds a scorpion's stinger. And that's sort of pleasure and pain principle. But again, try to figure out how those arms work with the rest of her anatomy. Again, if we sort of think about her shoulders being here, right, it just doesn't, it really doesn't work in the image at all. And again, that's typical mannerism. So it's a real confusing jumble of symbolism. And really, with this image, even though we can identify the four primary figures, there's still a lot of work to do on this image. There's still a lot yet to be deciphered. And that's, again, typical of mannerism, right? So this is really perhaps one of the best examples of mannerist art. Now, the man for whom it was done, Francis I, the King of France, was, at the time he received this, also in the midst of decorating his country palace outside of Paris, the Palace of Fontainebleau. Fontainebleau is a set of woods that was owned by the French throne for decades, if not centuries. And Francis takes an old hunting lodge and has it converted into a grand royal palace in Fontainebleau. And so he's busily decorating this, having it built and having the interior decorated. For the interior, he continues to show us his interest in Italian Renaissance artists. He hires 2 Italian artists to supervise and carry out all of the decorations in the Palace of Fontainebleau. Rosso Fiorentino is a painter, and he's responsible for painting the inset panel that we see. Francesco Primaticcio is a stucco artist. He's a sculptor, and he designs and executes the framing devices that include decorative elements like the fruit that we see at the bottom on the scroll, but also those mythological satyr figures on either side of the framing device. So these 2 artists work together in a very mannerist style to decorate the forest of Fontainebleau. And they again reflect for us Francis I's own great interest in Italian artists, people he would have called still Renaissance artists. The palace at Fontainebleau maintained or housed and maintained a printmaking shop. And they were making original prints plus copies of the paintings and some of the decorative elements in Fontainebleau. And these were given as gifts or sold to visitors who wanted to sort of recreate their own mini Fontainebleau back home. This print made significantly later, after the death of Rosso and Primaticcio, by René Boivin, one of the engravers that was resident at Fontainebleau and working in the Fontainebleau printmaking shop. Like the image of Venus that was also made for Francis I, the iconography here is not at all easy to decipher. And in fact, as we look at the different paintings in Fontainebleau, many of them are still up for grabs when it comes to trying to decipher exactly what they mean. With this particular image, in broad strokes, the crowd of people that we see are personifications of ignorance. They are blindfolded, right? A blindfold's a great symbol for ignorance. And they're flailing about, as you can see in the picture, arms amuck, some of them fallen to the ground, bound up by their own lack of understanding. But no one sees anything. Everyone's looking for an answer, if you will. They are ignorance itself. If we look at the fat man on the right, with his mouth open, we can see these strange proportions that are typical of the Mannerist period, those tiny little feet, the way in which the hips don't seem to work so well with the body. This is probably even more apparent with the figure immediately to the left of him, where we can see that the legs are muscular, but then if we try to figure out exactly how those legs sort of articulate up into the body here, it doesn't really make much sense. What happens in the area of the hips seems to sort of break down. The basic theme is that all this ignorance leads to sin. Here in the darkness, we see this large decorative urn with the Latin word mali on it. Mali means bad, it means sin. And this is exactly where ignorance leads, into the darkness and into sin. There is one man, however, who follows the light. And in fact, above the doorway that he's stepping through, he's leaving ignorance behind, moving forward. It's marked in Latin again with the words the portal of Jupiter. Jupiter is the Roman king of the heavens, and the man carrying a book, a sign of wisdom, of course, is now following the light into allegorical heaven and leaving behind the sin of ignorance and the sins of ignorance. The image is sometimes referred to as the education of King Francis, that this is an allegory for his wisdom, his own education. But the figure itself doesn't really look anything like King Francis I, as we see in this portrait of Francis from about the 1530s or so. Again, mannerism and style. The proportions are exaggerated, the poses are awkward, the anatomies are strange, the space is crowded, there's an overall lack of balance. And insofar as works for Francis I are concerned, there's an amazing eroticism as well. Here we see the ignorant figure reaching for something and I guess finding something, if you will, groping this woman's buttocks and her breast. Not out of, well, this is probably exactly how ignorance leads to sin, right? Not knowing what he's looking at and then, of course, finding something. Mannerism is everywhere in Europe in the middle and later part of the 16th century. It even hits some of our Renaissance pioneers. Michelangelo, for example, outlives the Renaissance. He doesn't die until the 1560s. And here's a later work by him, The Wall Underneath the Sistine Ceiling. This subject matter and this painting is covered in depth in one of the worksheets that's coming up. But I just wanted to point to the mannerist stylings of the piece, in particular the artificial anatomies, the lack of perfect Roman Renaissance proportions. If we look at Christ in the middle, this Last Judgment, he's casting the damned away from him. But look at that chest and look at that body and just, again, try to articulate it. It's almost as if in the middle, sort of right at his waist, the chest does one thing and is of one set of proportions, and then the legs seem, in fact, very different. But if we look at how that body is articulated around that area, and then if we look at the rest of his body, is he seated? Is he standing? Neither nor. And do the legs work relative to the rest of the body? No, they seem, in fact, significantly small to maintain a torso of that dimensions. There's, again, mannerism in a lack of spatial depth. Everything is hung as if it's a curtain close to the plane of the picture with no great depth behind it, no use of perspective. There's crowding and imbalance. Figures don't seem to have enough space to exist. They seem to slip and slide off of their perches and seem to be sort of mushed together like a bowl of beans, a bowl of cannellini beans, sort of a pile of figures here. To wrap up mannerism, we're going to look at Venice. As we saw in earlier lectures, Venice, the Renaissance of Venice is very different from the Renaissance in Rome and Florence. In mannerism, there also is some differences. In particular, the legacy of Titian is much stronger here than elsewhere in Italy. But at the same time, Mannerist styles impact Venice as well. Now, Jacopo Tintoretto is one of the primary Mannerist artists in Venice. He had, in fact, studied under Titian. We haven't seen this Titian yet. It's one of his most famous works, painted when he's still like in his early 20s, the high altarpiece for one of the most prominent churches in Florence, where it shows the Virgin Mary ascending to heaven, the assumption of the Virgin, the assuming of her soul into heaven, and the apostles down below witnessing it, and God up above receiving her soul. Now, Tintoretto on the left shows us the conversion of Saul. This is Saul of Tarsus, the anti-Christian Roman warrior who is struck blind from his horse in the book of Acts by God. And through his healing of the temporary blindness, he is converted to Christianity and becomes Paul, the Apostle Paul, who is responsible for writing the lion's share of the Christian Bible, the New Testament. So this is the moment of his conversion. And you can see God in the upper left corner. And I wanted to look at this because I think on a certain level, Tintoretto's God is a manipulation of Titian's God. And again, that idea of lifting motifs, reworking them from earlier artists is, again, part of what makes mannerism. But also it shows to us here the importance of Titian for Mannerist artists in Venice. Now, it's still typically Mannerist in that it's a confusing jumble. Decorative color choices, artificial poses, awkward anatomies. We see here God who has struck Saul blind. Sorry about that. Saul himself falls to the ground, front and center. He's relatively easy to find. His pose with his arms up, his shield has fallen off, his horse has darted away into the water at the right. The pose that we see here is, again, another pose, and this one much more directly borrowed from an earlier prototype. Here is a design by Raphael. Raphael made a series of designs for tapestries commissioned by the Pope to hang under the Sistine ceiling on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. And here's the conversion of Saul as designed by Raphael, with God coming in the clouds. And again, you can see that Tintoretto's God looks somewhat like this. But more direct is, of course, the figure of Saul himself, whose pose is directly borrowed from the Raphael. All of this secondhand borrowing, again, a hallmark of Mannerism. Now, Saul is front and center, but he competes for attention with all of the busy figures around him. Every inch seems to be filled with some sort of noise or cacophony. This opening of heaven and the striking blind of Saul has shaken up the entire world. We see clouds rolling across the skies and just a tumult of activity. People falling from their horses. A man on a white horse charging away, unable to contain it. All of these sort of compete for our attention away from Saul himself. Everywhere we look, we see figures rearing up, charging about, reacting to the sounds, the sights of heaven opening up and Saul being struck blind. The interesting thing, there's Saul's horse now charging into the water, people's running away from it as other horses, again, also driven mad by the sound, have jumped into the water. There's nothing in the Bible that suggests any of this. That's the interesting thing. This is all sort of created, this jumble of figures. If we read Acts about the conversion of St. Paul, the men traveling with Saul stood there speechless, it said. They heard the sound, but they did not see anything. And I think that's kind of fascinating, right? They hear the sound, but they see nothing. But there's nothing to suggest that horses flailed about and people. Look at how many of them are looking up toward the heavens. Tintoretto is just simply using the conversion of Saul to create this very mannerist approach to picture making, which is to fill everything with figures and use it with these sort of decorative color choices. Our last Mannerist artist, perhaps the best known of the Mannerist period, is El Greco. He's from the island of Crete, off the coast of Greece. This is where he got his nickname. But the island of Crete was part of the Republic of Venice, one of the territories controlled by Venice. And Tintoretto came to the capital city, came to Venice to study painting, and actually studied under Tintoretto. This is where he learned his work. He eventually then moved on from Venice to settle in Spain. And in fact, this painting on the right was part of a pair of pictures that he made for a chapel in Spain. This is where it was painted. So El Greco, a Greek artist, studied in Italy, painted in Spain. Very international, right? Because he studied in Venice, he was also very much influenced by Titian. And I think this makes a really nice comparison with the El Greco. Because it highlights what is mannerism about mannerism. If you look at Titian's composition, what we see is that the fact that the Virgin Mary at the top is sort of in a perfect circle, established by the arch of the frame and the row of angels down below her. And the gap between her and God is sort of the exact fulcrum of that circle. And we've seen that with Italian Renaissance pictures. This interest in geometry underlying all of the composition is sort of a hallmark. You'll also notice that the composition is more or less broken sort of clean in half. That the Virgin's feet, the upper half is heaven, the lower half is the apostles, and the artist has given us a clear sort of separation between the two, and little figures that bridge that difference here and there. The angel's feet coming down, the man's arm moving up. And then at the bottom, right, we have almost in the center the idea of an open area that's a triangle, but we also have all of these sort of stabilizing figures, right, in the middle here, that earth is stable and then heaven sort of swirls around. El Greco, on the other hand, and mannerism is very much the opposite of this. You'll notice that, again, we still have the Virgin Mary at the top, the human figures at the bottom, if you will, but there's no sort of clear distinction between the two because the Virgin comes so far down into their realm. You'll also notice that she's being held up by little angel heads at the bottom that don't seem to be sufficient to support her weight. And as we look at some of the details, we see the things that we've noted being hallmarks of mannerism. Jesus on her lap seems as if he's about to slip off, her knees down toward us so we can see Christ, but he seems almost as if he needs that hand on him to keep from simply sliding off her lap. You also notice that he's yanking at her finger, that time-worn symbol that we've seen a lot of images of Jesus do. Colors are fantastically decorative. I really love this sort of pink and green with the angel on the left, especially against those orangish yellow locks of the angel's hair. But look at the anatomy of the head of that angel, and especially those ears. They almost look like donkey ears. They're sort of too far forward on the forehead to work sufficiently from the pose. And then there's the proportions. Greco is noted in all of his works for these incredibly elongated figures. And we can see here, for example, the neck of this figure in scarlet, how elongated the figure has become. You can see it in her fingers as well. They seem stretched. The figure down here, the arm, also has that same sense of elongation, stretching. This is something El Greco does a lot that gives it a sort of artificial proportion. So what we've seen with mannerism is a move away from the harmony, balance, the perfection and idealism, or idealization of Renaissance imagery, and moving toward a sense of imbalance and decorativeness and artificiality that today we call mannerism. At the time, they would have still thought of themselves probably as Renaissance artists. And at the same time moving in a very, very different direction through the end of the 16th century. What we'll see next is that this changes drastically as we move into the 17th century, that there's a reaction against this mannerist style. And that's the stuff of our next lecture.